My name is Ruby. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I was described with words that sounded like compliments: responsible, level headed, low maintenance, the easy one. I work in financial operations for a mid sized healthcare company. I manage risk, track discrepancies, and reconcile numbers that don't want to reconcile themselves. I live in a quiet apartment just outside the city. I drink my coffee black. I return calls. I remember birthdays. I have never missed a payment in my life. If you met me at a dinner party, you would probably think I was kind, maybe a little reserved. You wouldn't assume I'm someone who keeps records, not emotionally, not historically. You definitely wouldn't assume I once calculated 12 years of debt. That word, debt, was introduced to me by my parents. They didn't say it dramatically. There was no screaming, no slammed doors, just a sentence delivered across a kitchen table one evening, casual as weather. "You owe us," my father said, "for raising you." It wasn't framed as cruelty, it was framed as reality, as math. I remember nodding. Because I've always been good at math. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about cutting people off in a blaze of righteous fury. There are no dramatic confrontations, no courtroom scenes, no viral moments. This is a story about quiet realization, about what happens when someone tells you that love was an investment and expects a return, about what happens when you take that statement seriously. Over 12 years, I paid for groceries, utilities, insurance gaps, property repairs, emergency transfers, temporary support that was never temporary. I covered things siblings couldn't manage right now. I sent money without reminders. I showed up. I absorbed stress. I made sure nothing collapsed. And one day, after being reminded again that I still owed them, I opened a spreadsheet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I calculated. What I discovered wasn't explosive. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, precise, irreversible. The truth didn't make me angry. It made it clear. This is the story of how I moved from obligation to clarity, without screaming, without revenge, and without losing myself. If you've ever been told that gratitude means lifelong repayment, I want you to sit with me for this. Have you ever wondered who decided the balance in your relationships and whether it was ever yours to carry? In my family, I was the dependable one. Not the brilliant one, that was my older brother Marcus. Not the sensitive one, that title belonged to my younger sister Claire. I was the stable one, the one who didn't need much, the one who could handle it. It sounds flattering until you realize handling it becomes your permanent assignment. Growing up in Portland, our house was small but orderly. My father worked in construction until his knees gave out. My mother worked part-time at a dental office. Money was never abundant, but it wasn't chaotic either. What we lacked in savings, we made up for in pride. We did it ourselves, my father liked to say. That phrase mattered. It meant independence. It meant dignity. It meant no one owed us, and we owed no one. At least, that's what I thought. When I left for college, I did it on scholarships and part-time jobs. I didn't ask them for help because I genuinely didn't want to burden them. I studied finance not because it was glamorous, but because I liked the clarity of it. Numbers didn't gaslight you. They didn't reinterpret history based on mood. If you paid $412.37, that was the number. Not around 400, not you never help, just data. After graduation, I built my career steadily. No dramatic leaps, no lottery wins, just consistency. Promotions earned the slow way. Rent paid on time. A small savings account that grew like a patient garden. The first time my parents asked for help, it felt natural. My father's knee surgery wasn't fully covered by insurance. There was a deductible gap of $3,200. My brother was between jobs. My sister had just started a master's program. "You're the only one stable right now," my mother said gently. She wasn't wrong. I transferred the money the next morning. They thanked me. My father said he'd pay it back when things settle. I told him not to worry. I meant it. That's how it began, not as an obligation, but as support. Over the next few years, small requests appeared. A car repair, a property tax shortfall, a temporary loan when my mother reduced her hours. None of it felt catastrophic. None of it felt manipulative. And each time, there was a similar sentence attached. You're just better with money than the others. You don't have kids. You're not struggling. You're strong. Strong. It's interesting how often that word is given to the person expected to absorb weight without complaint. Family gatherings reinforce the narrative. My brother's ideas were praised. My sister's feelings were accommodated. I was consulted when something needed solving. Ask Ruby, she'll figure it out. Ruby doesn't mind. Ruby's practical. I became a utility, a stabilizer, an invisible infrastructure. If I ever felt a flicker of discomfort, I dismissed it. This is what good daughters do, I told myself. This is gratitude. This is maturity. They never yelled at me. They never insulted me outright. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, they relied on me with quiet certainty, and I complied with quiet efficiency. By the time I was 30, I was contributing to my parents' household expenses monthly, not because they demanded it outright, but because it seemed like the logical extension of being the capable one. No one ever asked Marcus why he couldn't contribute more. No one ever suggested Claire take a semester off to help. I was the safe option. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I liked being needed. It gave me identity, purpose, moral high ground. Until the night my father leaned back in his chair, looked at me across the kitchen table, and reframed everything. You know, he said almost casually, after everything we spent raising you kids, it's only fair that you help. You owe us that. The word didn't echo dramatically. It settled, like dust on a ledger I hadn't opened yet. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel strong. I felt assessed, valued in numbers, accounted for. And something inside me, something quiet but precise, took note. The sentence didn't spark a fight. That's the thing about subtle disrespect. It rarely arrives as a slap. It comes wrapped in reason. You owe us. My father said it while folding his napkin as if he'd just commented on the weather. My mother didn't flinch. My brother kept scrolling on his phone. Claire was describing a podcast she liked. No one reacted, which meant I couldn't either. If a statement lands in a room and no one treats it as sharp, are you allowed to bleed from it? I smiled, not a forced smile, just the reflexive one I'd perfected over years of smoothing edges. I know, I said lightly. I'm happy to help. And I meant it, or at least I believed I did. On the drive back to my apartment, I replayed the sentence, not the tone, not the context, just the word. Oh. I tried to frame it generously. Maybe he meant it symbolically. Maybe he was joking in that dry way he sometimes used. Maybe I was being sensitive. After all, parents spend money raising children. That's objectively true. Housing, food, school supplies, doctor visits, soccer uniforms, field trips. There is a cost, but something about the phrasing shifted the atmosphere in my chest. It converted care into credit. Up until that moment, my financial support had felt like generosity, a choice, a contribution flowing outward from stability. Now it felt like installment payments. I told myself I was overthinking. I've always been prone to analysis, occupational hazard. The next month, when I set up the usual transfer for utilities and groceries, I hesitated for a second before clicking confirm, not long enough to stop, just long enough to notice. That was the first small cut. Not the amount, not the request. The reframing. At the following family dinner, my mother mentioned how lucky they were that I was so responsible. We don't have to worry about Ruby, she said proudly. She'll always do what's right. There was warmth in her voice, pride. But there was also expectation. Marcus joked that he should invoice me for emotional support. Everyone laughed. I did too. Claire squeezed my hand and said, "You're just built differently." Built different. As if resilience were a personality quirk instead of a survival strategy. No one asked how I felt about being the default solution. No one asked whether I wanted to continue contributing at the same level. It was simply assumed. And assumptions, when left unchallenged, harden into policy. I started noticing language patterns after that night. When my brother missed a credit card payment, it was a rough month. When Claire needed help with rent, it was temporary. When I covered property tax again because the construction season had been slow, my father said, "That's what family does." Family. The word expanded to include my resources, but rarely my boundaries. Still, I didn't confront anyone. There was no dramatic awakening, no epiphany soundtrack, just a quiet accumulation of data. The first small cut wasn't painful because of what it cost me financially. I could afford the transfers. It was painful because it suggested that my existence had come with a bill attached. That love had fine print. And the most disorienting part? Everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. I began to wonder whether I had misunderstood something fundamental about adulthood. Maybe this was normal. Maybe all grown children eventually repay their parents. But repayment implies a debt agreed upon. I had never signed anything. Yet I felt the weight of obligation settling into something more formal than gratitude. That night, instead of watching my usual comfort show, I opened my laptop. Not to calculate, not yet, just to look. I scrolled back through bank statements, years of transfers labeled casually, dad surgery, mom car, utilities, tax help. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became attention. I didn't total anything. I closed the screen before midnight and told myself I was being dramatic. Still, when I lay down to sleep, a single thought threaded through the dark. If I owe them, what exactly have I already paid? I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was becoming aware. And awareness is rarely loud. It's a small, precise cut that doesn't bleed immediately. But it marks the skin. After that night, nothing visibly changed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't escalate, it settles. The monthly transfers continued. The group chat stayed active. My mother still sends photos of her garden. My father still texted me articles about interest rates as if we were business partners instead of parent and child. But the language sharpened slightly. When I visited one Sunday, my father was reviewing bills at the kitchen table. He slid one toward me without looking up. "Can you take care of that?" It wasn't phrased as a question. I glanced at it. Home insurance increase, $780 difference for the year. "Sure," I said automatically. He nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject. No discussion of how the expense would be handled long term. No offer to split it. Just an assumption. Later that afternoon, Claire was talking about a weekend trip she wanted to take with friends. "I need to save," she sighed. "I can't keep draining my account." I almost laughed. Not at her, but at the irony. Because I was actively draining mine. But I told myself it was different. I was stable. I had a career path. I had savings. Helping them didn't destabilize me. At least not financially. Emotionally was harder to quantify. I began rationalizing with professional precision. They raised you for 18 years. They didn't charge you rent. They sacrificed vacations. You're single. You don't have children. This is just redistribution. Every time a flicker of resentment surfaced, I neutralized it with logic. Resentment felt immature, ungrateful, dramatic. I didn't want to be the daughter who changed after getting a good job, so I stayed quiet. When my brother asked if I could co-sign a short-term business loan because banks trust corporate types like you, I declined gently, but still gave him a smaller personal loan instead. When my mother hinted that their kitchen appliances were outdated and unsafe, I researched options and sent them money for a new refrigerator. Each act was voluntary. That's what made it complicated. No one forced me. But over time, voluntariness blurred into inevitability. Family gatherings reinforced the hierarchy in subtle ways. When discussions turned to money, all eyes drifted to me. Not because I demanded authority, but because I demonstrated competence. Ruby will know. Ruby can check that. Ruby understands contracts. I was consulted, but rarely considered. There's a difference. Consulting someone means you value their skill. Considering someone means you value their limits. I was the family's emergency fund disguised as a person. And because I rarely complained, my silence was interpreted as a capacity. Strong, stable, practical. Those words started to feel like handcuffs. The normalization wasn't loud enough to protest. It was incremental. A comment here, an expectation there. A casual reminder that family takes care of its own. One evening, my father repeated the phrase again, this time with a softer smile. "You know we invested a lot in you," he said. "College prep, tutoring, all those years." I paused. Most of my college prep had been self-driven. Scholarships had covered tuition. I'd worked throughout school, but I didn't correct him. because correcting him would sound like auditing my childhood. And what kind of daughter audits her childhood? That thought stopped me. So I let the narrative stand. Investment, return, owed. The words were no longer isolated comments, they were themes. And I kept rationalizing. Maybe this is just how families talk about sacrifice. Maybe I'm too literal. Maybe he doesn't mean it transactionally. But here's what I couldn't ignore. Every time the word owe surfaced, it erased choice. It reframed my help from generosity to obligation. An obligation has no ceiling. Still, I stayed. I stayed because the confrontation felt disproportionate. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No screaming, no threats, no cruelty. Just steady erosion. The kind that looks like love from the outside. The kind that sounds like responsibility. The kind that makes you question your own sensitivity. So I did what I've always done when emotions get complicated. I gathered information, quietly, without announcing that anything had changed, and without yet admitting to them or to myself that something had. There's a moment, subtle, almost administrative, when you realize you're no longer participating in a dynamic. You're maintaining it. For me, that realization came on an ordinary Tuesday night. I was sitting at my dining table, laptop open, reviewing my parents' monthly expenses the way some people review their own. Property tax projections, insurance renewals, utility averages. I had created a shared spreadsheet to help them stay organized. They rarely opened it, but they knew I would. That's when it occurred to me. I wasn't just helping, I was underwriting. Not just financially, structurally. If I stopped, things wouldn't collapse immediately. But there would be strain, adjustments, conversations they didn't want to have. And somehow, without explicit agreement, I had become the buffer between them and discomfort. That was my assigned role. Reliable, useful, invisible. I tested the theory one weekend. At dinner, my father mentioned that the water heater had been acting up. Normally, I would have asked follow-up questions. Brand, age, warranty status, estimated replacement cost. Instead, I nodded and continued eating. He glanced at me, waiting. I said nothing. The silence stretched, not awkward, just unfamiliar. Finally, he added, "I'll call someone about it." It was such a small shift, but it confirmed something important. The expectation wasn't only that I could solve it, it was what I would. And when I didn't immediately volunteer, there was a flicker, barely perceptible, of recalibration. Claire changed the subject. Marcus didn't notice, but I did. Over the next few weeks, I observed more carefully. When my brother talked about a potential investment idea, he framed it as an ambition. When I talked about adjusting my own budget goals, it was framed as flexibility. "You're fine," my mother would say. "You're good with money." Translation, "You can absorb more." I began noticing how often gratitude was paired with future expectation. "We're so lucky to have you," followed by, "Can you also look at this?" Pride, then request. Affection, then extension. None of it felt malicious. That's what made it difficult to label. But the pattern was consistent. My value was most visible when I was providing. I wasn't asked what I wanted long term. No one asked about my retirement goals, my travel plans. I hoped to buy a home bigger than my one-bedroom apartment, because in their mental accounting, I was stable, and stable meant surplus. The role solidified quietly. I was the family's infrastructure, the one who absorbed volatility, the one who didn't create problems, only solved them. And infrastructure isn't celebrated, it's assumed. One night, after transferring money to cover another short-term gap, I opened my black leather notebook, the one I use for work reflections, and wrote a single sentence. What is my role here and who assigned it? The answer came faster than I expected. They did, but I accepted it. That was the part that stung. No one forced me into the position. I stepped into it because it felt aligned with who I was. Competent, composed, dependable. But over time, dependability without boundaries becomes entitlement in other people's minds. Not malicious entitlement, just normalized. And normalization is powerful. It makes you complicit in your own exhaustion. That Tuesday night, I didn't feel angry. I felt defined, as if an invisible contract had been drafted years ago, and I'd been fulfilling its clauses without ever reading it. Reliable, useful, invisible. The problem with invisibility isn't that people can't see you. It's that they only see what you provide. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stepped slightly out of frame. Not dramatically, just enough to see whether anyone noticed the absence. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a dramatic accusation. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the most unremarkable way possible. I was at work, reviewing quarterly variance reports. Numbers are misaligned by small percentages. Nothing catastrophic. Just subtle discrepancies that required attention before they grew into real problems. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Hi, sweetheart. We're short on the mortgage this month. Can you send $1,400 just until your dad's next payment clears?" Just until. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because of the amount, I had it. Not because it was shocking, it wasn't. But because something inside me felt tired. Not resentful, not angry, just tired. I opened my banking app out of habit, thumb hovering over the transfer option. And for the first time in 12 years, I didn't move automatically. Instead, I opened my savings account, then my investment dashboard. Then I used a spreadsheet to track my personal financial goals. There it was, my plan to purchase a small townhouse within the next 2 years. A conservative projection, nothing extravagant, just a space that was fully mine. I calculated the impact of $1,400 leaving my account. Minimal in the short term, but repetitive in the long term. Patterns compound. That's something finance teaches you early. It's not the dramatic one-time expense that alters your trajectory. It's the steady outflow that becomes invisible. I leaned back in my chair and felt something crystallize. Not rebellion, not defiance, clarity. For years, I had framed my contributions as kindness, then as a responsibility, then quietly as an obligation. But I had never framed them as a cost. Not a cost to my lifestyle, not a cost to my stability, cost to my autonomy. I realized that if I continued at this pace, monthly contributions, periodic temporary infusions, emergency buffers, I would delay my own goals indefinitely. Not because I was incapable, but because I was underwriting another household. And here's the thought that landed like a stone dropping into still water. If I am still paying for their present, when exactly does the debt end? I looked at my mother's message again. No acknowledgement of the previous month's transfer. No discussion of a repayment timeline. Just an assumption. I didn't feel anger toward her. She wasn't trying to hurt me. In her mind, this was how family functioned. Resources flowed toward need, and I was the resource. The shift wasn't about the money. It was about identity. I wasn't their child in these transactions. I was their contingency plan. I closed my banking app without sending the transfer. Instead, I typed a response. "I can help this month, but we need to talk about a long-term plan." It was the mildest boundary imaginable. Even as I sent it, my heart rate increased slightly, not from fear of confrontation, but from unfamiliarity. I had never paired help with structure before. Within minutes, my phone rang. My father. His tone wasn't angry, just puzzled. What kind of plan? And that question, simple, neutral, revealed everything. There had never been a plan, just me. That afternoon, as I walked to my car after work, the air felt different. Not lighter, just sharper. I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to articulate. Support without limits isn't love. It's erosion. And erosion doesn't happen in storms. It happens in steady, polite rainfall. The shift wasn't explosive. It was administrative. I would still help, but I would no longer operate without accounting. Not emotionally, not financially, not existentially. That was the day I stopped being automatic. And once automation ends, awareness begins. After that Wednesday, I didn't announce a transformation. There was no family meeting, no manifesto about boundaries. On the surface, I was still Ruby. Still calm, still reliable, still the one who understood amortization schedules and insurance fine print. But internally, something precise had shifted. My silence was no longer reflexive. It was chosen. At the next family dinner, Marcus brought up a temporary cash flow issue with a client. He described it dramatically, emphasizing how unpredictable entrepreneurship could be. In the past, I would have asked questions: cash reserves, repayment timeline, contingency planning. This time I just listened. He eventually glanced at me, waiting. I offered a neutral nod. That sounds stressful. Nothing more. The conversation drifted elsewhere. No one pressed. It was subtle, but I noticed something important. When I didn't immediately step into solution mode, The responsibility redistributed itself, not fully, not gracefully, but slightly. My father began calling contractors directly instead of texting me screenshots of estimates. My mother started comparing grocery prices herself instead of asking me to check if this is reasonable. They still asked for help, but less automatically. And when they did, I responded differently. Send me the breakdown. What's the repayment plan? Is there another option? I kept my tone warm, neutral, professional. If they bristled, it was faint, more confusion than anger. You don't trust us? My father asked once. It's not about trust, I said calmly. It's about clarity. Clarity. That word became my anchor. Because here's what I understood. The moment you stop over-explaining, people project weakness onto your quiet. They mistake reduced enthusiasm for compliance. They assume you're tired, not deliberate. Silence, when unfamiliar, unsettles people. But I wasn't withdrawing in resentment. I was observing. I began tracking everything. Not secretly, just systematically. Every transfer, every temporary request, every repayment that never materialized, every time my brother borrowed without returning. In every instance, my contributions were reframed as expected rather than generous. I didn't confront anyone with the data. I simply documented it. At work, I managed risk exposure for multi-million-dollar budgets. It suddenly felt absurd that I had never applied that same discipline to my personal life. 12 years of assistance, 12 years of soft assumptions, 12 years of being the infrastructure. And I had never once asked, what is the total exposure? Silence gave me space to calculate. Without emotional noise, patterns became visible. The requests weren't random emergencies. They were cyclical. Tax season, insurance renewal, holiday overspending, business gaps, home maintenance. Predictable, which meant preventable. The more I observed, the calmer I became, because calm is what happens when confusion dissolves. They interpreted my new reserve as stress. You're working too hard, my mother said once. Don't forget family comes first. I smiled gently. Family had always come first. That was precisely the point. But for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something radical. What if I came first in my own ledger, not emotionally in a selfish way? Financially, in a factual way, silence became my strategy. I stopped offering unsolicited solutions. I stopped anticipating problems before they were voiced. I stopped cushioning consequences. I still showed up to birthdays, still brought dessert, still listened. But I no longer volunteered my stability as tribute. And here's what fascinated me most. No one accused me of changing, because I hadn't. I had simply reduced excess. The space where I used to rush in now remained open, uncomfortable at times, revealing always. Silence, I learned, is only mistaken for weakness by those who rely on your noise. And I was done being noisy. I was becoming a ledger. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like an ordinary evening. It looks like someone is sitting at a dining table with a laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside them. After silence became a choice, I began doing what I do best. I gathered data, not to attack, not to confront, to understand. I exported 12 years of bank statements, every transfer to my parents, every short-term loan to Marcus, every emergency wire, every grocery supplement, every insurance gap. I created categories: medical, housing, utilities, debt coverage, business support, miscellaneous. Then I did something I should have done a decade earlier. I added it up. The number wasn't cinematic. It didn't make me gasp. It made me still, because it wasn't just a total. It was a timeline. I could see the rhythm of my life inside it. Early career years when I contributed modestly, promotions that increased my capacity, the spike during my father's surgery, the steady climb when I began covering monthly expenses temporarily. The word temporarily appeared in my notes 14 times. None of those situations had formally ended. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I adjusted my posture in my chair and recalculated with inflation factored in. Then I opened a second spreadsheet. If I had invested those same amounts conservatively, index funds, average annual return, what would the growth look like? The projection populated the cells quietly. Compound interest is indifferent. It simply reflects what consistency does over time. The alternative scenario, money invested instead of transferred, wasn't fantasy wealth. It wasn't yachts and vacation homes. It was security. Earlier home ownership. Financial independence years sooner. Breathing room. That was the first time the word cost became tangible. Not moral cost, opportunity cost. And here's what they never noticed. I wasn't preparing to leave in anger. I was preparing to rebalance. At the same time, I reviewed something else, my childhood. Not emotionally, financially. Scholarships covered most of my tuition. Grants covered textbooks. I worked through college. I paid for my own car insurance at 19. I contributed to groceries during summer breaks. The narrative that they had invested heavily in me didn't align cleanly with documented reality. They had provided housing, food, basic care, which is what parents do. There was no luxury prep academy, no elite tutoring program funded by them, no trust fund. The story of massive parental investment was more emotional than financial. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I also reviewed something else, property records. The house they lived in had appreciated significantly over the years. There was equity, not extravagant, but real. If they downsized, they would be stable. If they adjusted spending, they would be stable. If my siblings contributed proportionally, they would be stable. The instability wasn't structural, it was relational. They relied on me because I made reliance easy. What they never noticed was that while they saw me as the family's safety net, I was building my own. I met with a financial planner, privately, not because I was confused, but because I wanted external clarity. I discussed long-term goals, estate implications, tax exposure if I continued informal transfers at scale. He asked a simple question. Is there a formal agreement in place? No. Is there equity in exchange? No. Is there a defined endpoint? No. He didn't judge. He just nodded slowly. Then this isn't support. It's a subsidy. That word settled differently than O. Subsidy implies imbalance. It implies one system propping up another. I walked out of that meeting with calm certainty. I wasn't angry at my parents. I wasn't disappointed in my siblings. I was aware. And awareness is leverage. They never noticed the shift because externally, nothing dramatic changed. I still transferred money when I said I would. I still visited on Sundays. I still listened. But behind the scenes, I was mapping the full architecture of dependency, understanding exposure, identifying pressure points. Not to exploit, to decide. Because once you understand the full ledger, past, present, projected future, you stop reacting emotionally. You start acting structurally. And structure, unlike emotion, doesn't waver. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened at 11:42 p.m. on a Thursday, with my apartment completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I had just finished updating the final column in my spreadsheet. 12 years. Principal amount transferred. Estimated inflation adjustment. Projected investment growth had it remained mine. I stared at the total figure for a long time, not because it was shocking, but because it was definitive. When my father said I owed them for raising me, I had accepted the premise without examination. I had allowed the emotional framing to bypass my analytical instincts. Now I had data, and data doesn't argue. It clarifies. The number I had transferred over 12 years exceeded what they had likely spent directly on my post-secondary education gaps, extracurriculars, and non-essential support during my adolescence. Not by a small margin, by a meaningful one. And that was without including the intangible contributions, coordinating appointments, reviewing contracts, negotiating bills, managing insurance paperwork, and doing their taxes the past 5 years without charging a fee. If this were a client relationship, the ledger would not suggest debt. It would suggest overpayment. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no surge of vindication. There was a quiet, almost clinical realization. The debt wasn't mine. I said it out loud once, just to hear it in the room. The debt wasn't mine. It didn't sound rebellious. It sounded accurate, and accuracy is stabilizing. For so long, I had operated under an inherited narrative: parents sacrifice, children repay. Gratitude expressed through financial loyalty. But repayment implies a deficit, and the deficit, when documented, was not on my side of the ledger. That was the private reveal. Not that they were malicious, not that they had intentionally exploited me, but the story we were living inside was miscalculated. They believed they had invested disproportionately in me. I believed I was honoring that investment. The numbers told a different story, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I opened a new document and wrote 3 questions. If I continue at this rate for another 10 years, what does my life look like? If I stop abruptly, what happens to theirs? If I transition strategically, what is fair? That third question mattered most, because this was never about punishment. It was about proportion. I didn't want to devastate them financially. I didn't want to prove a point through cruelty. But I also refused to keep subsidizing a narrative that no longer aligned with reality. The clarity felt almost physical, like adjusting your spine after years of slight misalignment. Nothing dramatic has changed externally, but internally, pressure redistributes. I revisited every message where the word "oh" had appeared. Every subtle reminder of parental sacrifice is framed as an outstanding balance. And for the first time, those statements didn't carry emotional weight. They read like assumptions unsupported by evidence. In finance, when an assumption doesn't match the numbers, you revise the model. You don't argue with the spreadsheet. You adjust the structure. That night, I didn't text anyone. I didn't confront. I didn't hint. I closed my laptop, placed my black leather notebook on top of it, and turned off the lights. Because the most powerful realizations don't require announcement. They require implementation, and implementation requires a decision. The debt wasn't mine, which meant something else was true. I had options, real ones, and for the first time in 12 years, they were entirely in my hands. Clarity is quiet. The decision is quieter. After the private reveal, I didn't rush into action. I let the numbers sit with me for a week. I went to work. I attended meetings. I had dinner with a friend. I visited my parents on Sunday as usual. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. When you finally understand that a debt isn't yours, you face an uncomfortable freedom. Because if you're not obligated, then continuing becomes a choice, and choices carry responsibility. I outline my options the way I would for a corporate risk review. Option 1, continue as is, maintain monthly support, absorb periodic emergencies, delay my own long-term goals, preserve peace, preserve the narrative. Cost, ongoing financial exposure, quiet resentment, compounded opportunity loss. Option 2, abrupt withdrawal, stop all transfers, force immediate adjustment, confront the narrative head-on. Cost, shock, emotional rupture, potential long-term fracture in relationships. Option 3, structured transition, define an endpoint, communicate clearly, reduce support over time. Replace informal subsidy with transparency. Cost, discomfort, resistance, recalibration of roles. I stared at those 3 paths for a long time. The first was familiar, predictable. It required the least courage in the short term. The second was tempting in its simplicity, clean, immediate, but it felt reactive, not aligned with who I am. The third required patience, strategy, emotional steadiness. It required me to tolerate their confusion without softening my boundary. That was the irreversible part. Because once you introduce structure into a dynamic built on assumption, you can't go back to being automatic. I chose option 3, not because it was easiest, but because it was fair. Fair to them, fair to me. That evening, I drafted a plan, 6-month transition period, gradual reduction of monthly contributions, clear documentation of what I had provided historically, not as an accusation, but as context. A meeting to discuss their long-term financial adjustments, downsizing options, expense reductions, and equitable contributions from Marcus and Claire. I didn't frame it as withdrawal. I framed it as realignment. Before sending any messages, I asked myself one final question. Am I doing this to punish or to protect? The answer was immediate. Protect. Protect my future. Protect my autonomy. Protect the integrity of my generosity so it remains voluntary, not extracted. That distinction mattered. The next Sunday, when we gathered for dinner, I watched them differently. My father is discussing a home improvement idea. My mother describes rising grocery costs. Marcus is talking about scaling his business. Claire is considering a vacation. All of them were operating under the quiet assumption that if something fell short, I existed. I felt no anger toward them, just awareness of gravity. If I shifted, their system would feel it. But gravity doesn't negotiate, it simply operates according to mass and distance. And I had been carrying more mass than anyone acknowledged. After dinner, I said calmly, I'd like to set up a time this week to talk about finances, just to plan long term. There was a pause. My mother looked mildly concerned. Is something wrong? No, I said evenly. I just think we need clarity. There was that word again. Clarity. My father nodded slowly. Okay. He didn't sound threatened. He sounded uncertain. That was the moment I knew the decision was irreversible. Because uncertainty means the old script no longer fits. I drove home that night feeling steady. Not triumphant, not anxious, resolved. The debt wasn't mine, which meant the responsibility for adjustment wasn't either. But I would give them structure, not silence, not an explosion, structure. And structure, once introduced, changes everything. The week before our scheduled conversation, I didn't rehearse speeches. I prepared documents. There's something grounding about paper, about numbers printed in black ink instead of floating in digital abstraction. It makes things feel less emotional, more factual. I compiled a clean summary. Total financial contributions over 12 years. Breakdown by category. Months of consistent household support. Instances labeled temporary. Estimated opportunity cost. Conservative projection. No commentary, no accusations, just data. I also created a second document, a 6-month transition plan. Month 1 to 2, 75% of current support. Month 3 to 4, 50%. Month 5 to 6, 25%. Month 7 onward, $0 recurring subsidy. Included recommendation for expense adjustments, downsizing evaluation, and equitable sibling contribution structure. I sent Marcus and Claire a brief message separately before the meeting. I'll be discussing restructuring financial support with Mom and Dad. I believe responsibility should be shared proportionally. We'll talk Sunday. Marcus responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Claire asked, "Is everything okay?" "Yes," I replied, "and just planning long-term. No drama. No warning of a storm, because this wasn't a storm. It was a recalibration." That Sunday, I arrived at my parents' house with a slim folder in my bag. We ate dinner first. I waited until the dishes were cleared. Then I placed the folder on the table. "I've been reviewing finances," I began calmly. "I think we need a structured plan moving forward." My father leaned back slightly. Defensive posture, subtle. "What kind of plan?" I slid the first page toward him. "I've contributed consistently for 12 years. I'm not upset about that, but there's never been an end point. That needs to change." Silence filled the room, not hostile, just dense. My mother adjusted her glasses and looked at the numbers. Marcus shifted in his seat. Claire read quietly. No one interrupted. That told me something important. This wasn't invisible to them. It was just unspoken. "I didn't realize it added up like that," my mother said softly. "It does," I replied. No edge, no sarcasm. My father cleared his throat. "We always intended to manage things ourselves." "I know," I said. "And you can. That's why this is a transition, not a cutoff." I slid the second document forward. "This gives everyone time to adjust. I'm not withdrawing in anger, I'm restructuring." Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Are you saying we haven't done enough?" "I'm saying it needs to be proportional," I answered evenly. No raised voices, no accusations, just alignment. They asked questions, practical ones. What about emergencies? What about property taxes? What about medical surprises? "I'm not disappearing," I said, "but I'm not the default solution anymore." That sentence shifted the air. Default solution. For the first time, the role had been named. The conversation lasted less than an hour. No one exploded. No one stormed out. But something foundational moved. Driving home, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Not because I had withdrawn money, because I had withdrawn the assumption. Over the next month, the first reduced transfer went through. No one commented directly, but I noticed subtle changes. My father postponed a non-essential home upgrade. My mother began couponing again as she used to years ago. Marcus mentioned picking up a consulting contract. Claire canceled her weekend trip. Adjustment, not collapse. They had always been capable. They had just been buffered. And buffers create complacency. I didn't announce each step of the transition. I simply executed it. Quietly. Consistently. The way I manage everything else in my life. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about steadiness. And steady shifts are harder to resist than dramatic ones. Because by the time anyone fully processes what's happening, the structure has already changed. Consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They arrive as an inconvenience. About 6 weeks into the transition, I began noticing the shifts. Not dramatic hardship, friction. My father called one evening, not to ask for money, but to ask about refinancing options. Rates aren't great, he admitted, but maybe we should have looked at this earlier. Should have. There was no accusation in his tone, just recognition. I explained the basics, sent him 2 comparison tools, and stopped there. I didn't offer to cover the difference. He didn't ask. That silence felt new. Marcus texted me less frequently about short-term cash gaps. Instead, he mentioned taking on smaller contracts he'd previously dismissed as beneath him. Cash flow stability, he wrote once, boring but necessary. I almost smiled. Claire picked up extra shifts at her internship. She stopped hinting about trips or new furniture. She began asking me for budgeting templates instead of transfers. The system was recalibrating, not collapsing, recalibrating. But recalibration is uncomfortable. At Sunday dinners, the mood shifted slightly, not tense, just more restrained. Financial topics weren't casually floated anymore. There was awareness in the room now. One evening, my mother said softly, "It's just different." She didn't specify what, but I knew. Different meant the cushion was thinner. Different meant decisions required trade-offs again. Different meant they could feel the weight I had been absorbing. There was a moment around month 3 when my father's voice carried a trace of frustration. We never expected things to be this tight. I held his gaze calmly. "They aren't tight," I said gently. "They're just accurate." He didn't argue, because he understood the distinction. Accuracy feels harsher than comfort. Comfort hides imbalance. Accuracy reveals it. I watched them adjust in small ways. Delayed upgrades, simplified holidays, conversations between my parents that didn't include my name as a solution. And here's what surprised me. They didn't resent me, not openly. They were unsettled, yes, but there was no explosion, because I hadn't attacked them. I had provided structure. Structure doesn't humiliate. It clarifies. The biggest shift, though, wasn't in their finances. It was in how they spoke about me. "You've helped more than we realized," my mother said quietly one night while washing dishes together. I didn't respond immediately. She continued, "We got used to it." There it was. Not entitlement, habituation. When something reliable exists long enough, people stop experiencing it as generosity. It becomes baseline. Like electricity. You don't thank the outlet every time you flip a switch. You only notice when it stops working. And I had reduced voltage. Do not cut power, just reduced it. The consequences weren't catastrophic. They were educational. For them. For me. Because as they adjusted, I adjusted too. I increased my investment contributions. I reopened conversations with a realtor. I felt the quiet acceleration of momentum in my own life. Not explosive wealth. Not dramatic freedom. Just forward motion that had been stalled. There was one evening, toward the end of month 4, when Marcus said something that lingered. "I guess we leaned on you more than we should have." He said it casually, almost as an aside. But it mattered. Because recognition, even small, is powerful. I didn't say, "Yes, you did." I said, "We all did what felt easy at the time." That was true. It had been easier for them to rely on me, and easier for me to accept the role. The consequences were unfolding, not as punishment, as recalibration. And recalibration, while uncomfortable, is rarely fatal. It just forces balance. By month 5, the adjustments had settled into routine. Bills were paid differently. Conversations were framed differently. My name appeared less frequently in group chats attached to screenshots of invoices. The system had adapted. But there was one thing no one had anticipated: equity review. My father had finally met with a financial advisor about downsizing, not because they were in crisis, but because the margin was thinner now. A week later, he called me. His voice wasn't angry. It was strained. "The house is worth more than we thought," he said, "but we should have refinanced years ago or sold when the market peaked." There was a pause. "We relied on you instead." It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. And realization carries a particular kind of regret. Not explosive regret. The quiet kind. The kind that understands the past can't be restructured retroactively. Because here's the part that no one says out loud when dependence becomes normalized. When someone consistently absorbs your financial pressure, you delay necessary decisions. You postpone discomfort. You maintain a lifestyle longer than your structure supports. And over time, those delays compound. They had options years ago, refinancing earlier, reallocating spending, asking Marcus and Claire for proportional support, downsizing gradually instead of urgently evaluating. But as long as I existed as a stabilizer, urgency never materialized. Now it had. Not because they were broke, but because the buffer had thinned. One Sunday evening, my mother sat across from me at the table, fingers wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "We thought you'd always be there," she said quietly. I held her gaze. "I am here," I answered, "just not as a subsidy." The word landed heavier than I intended. She flinched slightly, not at the tone, but at the accuracy. Too late to fix it doesn't mean a catastrophe. It means the easy version of the solution has expired. The version where nothing changes except your transfer amount. That window had closed. Now their solutions required structural shifts. Marcus would need to contribute consistently, not occasionally. Claire would need to prioritize differently. My parents would need to consider selling the house they had assumed they'd age into. None of these were punishments. They were realities that had been postponed. And postponement, once removed, feels like a loss. My father admitted something that surprised me. "I didn't realize how much pressure that put on you." I believed him, because if he had truly understood, he would have adjusted earlier. Most dependence isn't born from cruelty. It's born from convenience, and convenience rarely self-corrects. There was a moment during that conversation when I felt the old reflex surface, the urge to soften everything, to say, "It's okay, forget the plan, I'll keep covering things." The reflex was strong, because stepping back from being needed can feel like betrayal. But I didn't reverse course, not because I lacked compassion, because I understood something fundamental now. If I resumed the old pattern, I would be teaching them that discomfort is negotiable, if applied long enough. And that would erase everything we had recalibrated. "It's not too late," I said gently. "It's just later than ideal." That distinction mattered. They weren't ruined, they were adjusting. But the adjustment required acceptance that the old structure, where I silently absorbed the overflow, was over. And that truth, once visible, can't be unseen. Too late to fix it the easy way, but not too late to fix it, honestly. The final conversation happened in early spring, not because of a crisis, because of paperwork. My parents had decided to list the house. Not urgently, not dramatically, but decisively. They invited me over on a Thursday evening to go over some things. The tone was neutral, almost businesslike. I brought nothing with me this time. No folder, no projections, just myself. The house felt the same couch, same faint scent of laundry detergent, same framed photos lining the hallway. The physical space hadn't changed, but the architecture underneath it had. We sat at the kitchen table. My father cleared his throat first. "We've been reviewing everything," he began. "You were right." There was no resentment in his voice, just fatigue and acceptance. "This place made sense when we thought the finances would stay supplemented," he continued carefully. "But it doesn't make sense now." Supplemented. He didn't say, "when we thought you'd keep paying." He didn't have to. My mother folded her hands in front of her. "We should have structured things sooner." I nodded once. Not vindicated, not triumphant, just steady. "I didn't handle it perfectly either," I said. "I should have set limits earlier." That was important. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a recalibration. Marcus joined via video call. Claire sat beside me. For the first time, the responsibility in the room felt evenly distributed. No one was looking at me to fix it. They were discussing it. That difference was everything. There were practical questions, moving timelines, equity distribution, and rental options. I offered input when asked. I refrained when not. At one point, my father looked directly at me. "When I said you owed us, I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I considered that. "I know," I replied calmly, "but it shaped things." He nodded. There was no dramatic apology, no emotional unraveling, just recognition. Recognition is quieter than remorse, but sometimes more durable. My mother's voice softened. "You've done more than enough." More than enough. The phrase settled in my chest differently than I ever had. It wasn't dramatic validation. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement closes loops. No one raised their voice. No one accused. No one recited past grievances. We didn't need to, because the numbers had already spoken. The house listing went live 2 weeks later. When it sold, they downsized into a smaller place. Manageable, modest, stable. Marcus committed to a fixed monthly contribution. Claire did the same, not because I demanded it, Because the structure required it. That evening, after everything was signed, my father walked me to my car. "I'm proud of you," he said. He had said that before, usually about promotions or achievements. This time it felt different. This time it wasn't about what I provided. It was about what I protected. And I realized something quietly powerful. Confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes it's just a room full of adults acknowledging reality without theatrics. No explosion, no humiliation, no revenge, just balance restored. The townhouse closed this 6 months later. 2 bedrooms, small office, enough light in the mornings to make coffee feel ceremonial. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't a statement, it was mine. When I stood alone in the living room after the movers left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. For years, my identity had been built around stability for others. I was the reliable one, the quiet solution, the stabilizer. Now, for the first time, stability included me. The family dynamic didn't fracture after the house sale. It matured. Sunday dinners continued, just in a smaller kitchen. Marcus talks more realistically about cash flow now. Claire asks me for advice, not rescue. My parents discuss budgeting openly without deferring to me as the default. I still help sometimes, but help feels different when it's chosen. There's no invisible ledger humming in the background, no internal calculation of whether I'm meeting an unspoken quota, because that narrative dissolved, not in anger, in accuracy. Something else changed too. I stopped equating usefulness with worth. That was the deeper shift. For most of my adult life, I felt valuable when I was providing, when I solved, when I absorbed. It's intoxicating, being the strong one. It earns admiration. It avoids conflict. It positions you as indispensable. But indispensability is a trap if it's built on imbalance. Now, when I sit at dinner and someone mentions a financial concern, I listen without instinctively reaching for my phone. Sometimes I offer advice. Sometimes I don't. And nothing collapses. That's how I know the structure is healthy. My relationship with my parents feels quieter now. Less transactional, more honest. There's still love, but it's not layered with obligation. I no longer carry the subtle tension of proving gratitude through funding. And here's the part I didn't expect. I don't feel distant from them. I feel closer. Because clarity removed the undercurrent. When expectations are explicit, affection doesn't have to compete with resentment. Professionally, I've accelerated. Increased investments, planned travel, considered possibilities I once quietly postponed. Not because I resent what I gave, but because I recognize what I delayed. And I'm not trying to catch up. I'm simply moving forward. If someone asked me now who I am, I wouldn't say I'm the reliable one. I'd say I'm the balanced one. Balance doesn't mean detached. It means proportionate. It means generosity without self-erasure. It means boundaries without bitterness. The debt wasn't mine. But the lesson was, love given freely is powerful. Love extracted through obligation corrodes slowly. And the quietest form of dominance isn't control. It's self-alignment. For a long time, I believed maturity meant absorbing more than everyone else. More responsibility, more cost, more silence. I thought that was a strength. And in some ways it was. But strength without boundaries eventually becomes self-erasure. When my father said I owed them for raising me, I accepted the premise without question. Not because I was weak, but because I was loyal. Because I equated gratitude with repayment. It took 12 years and one spreadsheet for me to realize something simple. Love is not a loan. Parenthood is not an investment portfolio. And adulthood does not require lifelong financial penance. The debt wasn't mine. That sentence didn't make me angry. It made me free. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't cutting anyone off. It was structured. It was choosing clarity over comfort. It was allowing short-term discomfort so long-term balance could exist. My parents aren't villains. My siblings aren't manipulators. And I'm not a victim. We were a family operating on unexamined assumptions. And assumptions, when left unchecked, quietly shape entire decades. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Being the strong one doesn't mean carrying everything. It means knowing what's yours and what isn't. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't raising your voice. It's opening a ledger. It's asking calmly, is this accurate? It's adjusting accordingly. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you owed someone emotionally or financially just for existing? And if you looked at your own ledger, what would it actually say?